parties that is supposed, I mean, is expected to do better in terms of electoral results, that is Brothers of Italy, the far-right party led by Giorgia Meloni, we'll see that actually migration and Islamization, whatever that means, are linked and are presented as key challenges that this party is willing to tackle if, of course, it's going to win the election.
Also in Rome, Andrea De Petris, surely the far right do have a point. This is illegal immigration that they seem to be talking about. This is criminal gangs that are involved, putting people onto the sea, putting their lives in danger, and we're watching people die as they try and make that journey. The far right do have a point, don't they?
Well, actually not really, since according to international law, you cannot call an immigrant illegal as long as you didn't identify him or her. So basically, every country which sign international agreements, like Italy, are firstly obliged to let people come to the territory if they're trying the safest place and closest place they have to reach. And then afterwards, they firstly have to identify them and find out if they are legally or illegally trying to come into the country.
Well, let's bring in Yambio David Oliver. Yambio David Oliver is a migrant. He recently made the journey from Libya. Before we get into any questions, can you just explain to us and to our audience what your experience was? How did you get into Italy?
Well, I will start back as the previous speaker just mentioned that you cannot call a person an immigrant illegally until you have already done the procedures and able to interview and identify the person. So it reads back to my country in 2016 when I had to flee my country, South Sudan, and then fleeing all the way to the northern Sudan to Chad. And I found myself in Libya because the given situation in the countries where I had to cross was not favoring. So I had to constantly migrate. And Libya has, of today, what I found upon my arrival in Libya was only nightmare, tortures, extortions made. And all this system was being funded by the European and the Italian government. And when I tried to cross the sea, I was forcibly intercepted and pushed back to the Libyan detention centers. This only happened not once or twice. And with all this and the continuous experience of humiliation that I had to endure and seeing loved ones drowned at sea, my friends and the people that I loved, you know, they just got perished or they disappeared in these official and informal detention centers, all a system which is fully funded by the Italian government. Until last year, to be short, when I was living in a garage west of Tripoli when the authorities, the Libyan authorities and its militias, they came for us in the middle of the night with armored cars and heavy weapons. They arrested everybody violently, pregnant women, there were children and elderly disabled. They were not ready to identify who had the right to stay in Libya or who were asylum seekers, who were refugees. Because Garage was dominated and it was about 10,000 population of people living in that particular neighborhood. But this did not happen. They used violence and took people to inhuman detention centers, a well-known detention center, which is at Mabani, and many more informal detention centers, which created a mode of economic growth for these militias because they benefited from people from both parties, from receiving money from Italy and from the people themselves. It was when we created a permanent garrison in front of the UNHCR headquarters in Tripoli. And of course, we went to the UNHCR headquarters trying to find protection, which they were not able to give us because they claimed that they had limited mandate to operate in Libya in a way that they could protect its asylum seekers and the refugees who are registered within the system in Tripoli. This went on, we had to protest because we were living and surviving barely by the sidewalk of Tripoli in front of the UNHCR headquarters. It went on for 3 months and 10 days.
Sorry, David, we are going to be running out of time, and I want to get to everybody. When did that come to an end, and when did you actually physically make the crossing into Rome, into Italy?
Yeah, I made the crossing into Italy on the 21st of June, and it was a very terrible journey because I was asking for regular routes to enter Rome, but I was denied access even by the Tribunal Court of Rome when I was still in Libya, being persecuted by the Libyan authorities and its militias for trying to speak about what was happening. So I had to hop onto a dingy boat, which was unworthy for the sea journey. But luckily, I made it to Italy, still to be met with different challenges, because, as he said before, we were being called illegal before we even landed into the Italian territory.
Andrea, you've heard Yambio David Oliver's story there. This is a failure of policy almost on every single level, surely. It just explains what those failures might be.
Well, actually, this is quite a long story. Italy has been struggling with migration phenomenon for years now, so you cannot really call it a sort of emergency right now. If you have politicians trying to figure out a crisis because that is actually more a political attempt for campaign and so on. But it's not a surprise anymore. Political actors and parties failed through the years. This is true in terms of failing to create a real integration policies for the migrants which arrived in Italy and were entitled to remain. We're talking of asylum seekers and people which obtain asylum afterwards. But then, once they obtain a permission to stay, they didn't find any occasion to really integrate in terms of, education, work, facilities, whatever, which made, of course, difficult for these people to have a sort of normal life in Italy, which we are looking for. But it's not their fault. It's fault of the institutions which did not provide proper policies through the years for that.
Cecilia, for too long now, governments have used migrants as a political tool, as a political weapon. Let's take Turkey, for example. It kept Syrian refugees until it couldn't keep them in their country anymore because they were furious with Europe, so they allowed them to cross into Europe. Greece has illegally detained people. Italy has illegally detained people. The UK is trying to use a third-party centre in Rwanda to try and process immigration requests. Now, why has this become such a European political issue, and why now?
So it is not really, it isn't surprising, right? Migration is, as we were saying before, a controversial issue. It's something that touches upon different aspects. We have the fear of invasion that are, of course, sort of a weapon used by populist parties. We have the economic sort of fears. We have these fears connected to a loss of identity or possible threat to identity. So I think it's not surprising that migration is contentious. What I find to be particularly disturbing is the number of double standards that we are witnessing right now. So first of all, think about what happened with the weaponization of asylum seekers on the Polish border, which happened last winter. And then think about how, thankfully, Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed into Poland, right? So we see a double standard there. I think it's an European issue simply because Europe is a complex polity, and countries are affected by migration in different ways. And interestingly, the countries that are perhaps frontline countries, so Poland, but also Greece and Italy that you mentioned, are those that perhaps experienced or have been experiencing financial problems, for instance, right?
So
I think remember the financial crisis that hit Greece and also Italy very seriously. So I think there's an issue, really a core issue for the European Union. It's about policy, it's about coming up with policy solutions, but it's also about being true to its values. I think we're really seeing these exposed right now with the resources that have been rightly deployed to help Ukrainian refugees. So it means that the resources are there, and we can set up systems to welcome people that are fleeing war scenarios, right? But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that both EU institutions and member states are hesitant to take up because, again, it goes back to domestic politicization of migration. So just if I can just add, we're talking about center-right parties instrumentalizing migration, but actually the policies, the agreements, for instance, between the Italian government and the Libyan Coast Guard that essentially produce a number of appalling human rights abuses were put in place by a center-left government. So it's
across
across the political spectrum. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
It's across the board. Well, let me bring in Yambia David Oliver here. Andrea, I will come to you very quickly shortly. But Yambia, white Ukrainian refugees, they're the good refugees, they're the good migrants, they're the people that we should be helping, not black people like you. That's what the far right are saying. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel completely dehumanized. I feel completely like being neglected, being denied even by the international community, because when we look at the period that the war started in Ukraine, we were still in the street of Tripoli. We tried to approach the European Parliament. We tried to approach the Italian government to look into what was happening in Libya. And there was no response. People were, we find for us as a refugee, we find every death of a single person as a tragedy, not only in Ukraine, not only about a black person. We feel completely that we have no voice, but this is not anymore. We will continue to have a voice because we cannot continue to be silenced and to be denied in this way.
Andrea, how useful is it to have somebody like Yambia David Oliver, like to have an organisation like Refugees in Libya that gives a voice to those refugees? Is that voice being heard?
Well, this is a good point. Of course, it's very important to have organizations which are trying to describe the situation of people in Libya and actually in other countries, in all North Africa and even, in the under-Sahara countries. But this is not enough. We need to have more, better channels to bring their voices into the political debate at national level in Italy and the European level as well. If I may give you one more element of discussion about the double standards between Ukrainian refugees and North African refugees. In Italy, on March 22nd, there were 61,000 people, refugees coming from Ukraine. You know how many people are in Lampedusa right now? 1,727 people, and we call this an emergency. So you see, we are dealing with very different figures, but the political debate is, for some reason, to put in this emergency in Lampedusa as the real crisis for the real danger for Europe and for Italy on one side. On the other side, we are really, and of course it's correct to be there, to be like that, we are completely ready to welcome people from another part of Europe, even if the figures are so different. This is very important for me to put under stress for correctly find out and figure out what we are talking about.
I was about to bring those figures up. The UN have figures as well. They are in the 400s from coming from individual countries, but 1,700 people in Lampedusa, Sicilia. It isn't a huge amount of people, yet the value isn't the figures, is it? The value is the way the far right can use it as a political tool. It doesn't matter how many people there are.
Absolutely, and we knew this from the very beginning. When when the government fell, lost the confidence of the parliament, we knew that this electoral campaign was going to be about migration. Well, not exclusively about that, but also about that. If I can add something more, something else to what the colleague was saying before, there's sort of an ironic aspect to the migration debate in Italy, which is never brought up. Italy is a country that is experiencing a serious demographic crisis, which means that we actually need migrants. There's no way we can survive, and our welfare system can be supported in the coming years and decades unless we bring in migrants. But this is again a point that is never brought up. And the only way in which this problem, the demographic crisis, is framed is about birth rate, and it's about encouraging women to have kids, etc. But yes, so as you said, like it's not about the figures. If it were about the figures, we would actually probably be trying to integrate as many migrants as possible.
Let's talk about this idea of integration. I'll come to you, Andrea, first. You've got to integrate these people. Yes, they get here from Libya. Yes, they are arriving like Yambu David Oliver is, but the systems aren't there to integrate them. Or are they, and are they just being abused?
Well, it's hard to say. The point is, if you compare the policies adopted by Italy in the last years with other countries, for instance, Germany, you will see that what we are trying to do in Germany is trying to help integration, even allowing people which were officially not allowed to remain in Germany to start, education courses for possible work activities afterwards, because they think as long as you have these people there, it's better to try to educate them and give them a possible chance for integration, even if you don't know if these people are allowed to remain for years afterwards. But it is a very, I would say, very practical approach to the thing. If you remain to the ideological approach that, people coming from North Africa are potential criminals who do not want to integrate, want to change the society, want to, to change our cultural roots, whatever, you will never grow up from this point. And you will still remain the same kind of a vision in the political debate, in the political opinion, that migrants from Africa are a danger. But they're not. As our colleague said, we will need people from the rest of the world, not only from North Africa, because we have a very strong need for occupation. The European Union understood that. In the last months, they issued an official communication saying that the European Union should support immigration from abroad, because the whole European Union, the 27 member states, will need people for work, for activities, for education, whatever, in the nursery and hospital care. We need a lot of these people. And we know that we will not be able to cover all these occupation activities with the national, So it's a matter of interest for European countries first to try to integrate these people.
Cecilia, just quickly, because we are running out of time, you did touch upon this earlier. No one is hearing that argument in Italy, are they? No one is hearing the argument that we need refugees. It's too political.
No one. It's too political, but what's interesting, for instance, just a couple of days ago, it was kind of surprising, but again, not surprising. For the first time ever, the leader of, ever, in a long time, the leader of the Democratic Party, this is the center-left party running currently for this upcoming election, mentioned the fact that the party is not going to renew its support to the mission that Italy launched to cooperate with the Libyan Coast Guard, right? And it was like he announced it on Twitter. And it was kind of surprising in a sense, because they've been very quiet. They were expected to be more vocal about human rights and less vocal about the threat of migration. But in fact, the center-to-left party was in a sense, repressive in many ways as center-to-right parties. So this is like an interesting development. So they're not really saying we need to protect human rights. They're not saying this openly because, again, it's not very popular at this point as a view. And they would be attacked by the right, of course, immediately. But they kind of change their positioning on the issue a little bit.
I want to thank all our guests, Andrea De Petris, Yambio David Oliver and Cecilia Emma Sotilotta. And I want to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
The latest news as it breaks.
The country will vote on Monday on a controversial constitutional referendum, which is widely expected to boost President Kais Saied's authority.
With detailed coverage.
The cost of fertilizer has more than doubled this season. That's largely due to the war in Ukraine.
From around the world.
All of these cows are infected with foot and mouth disease. They are dairy cattle, but their milk production has dropped by more than 70%.
After a lifetime within the walls of an Iranian zoo, a Bengal tiger's horizons are suddenly widened when she lands an unlikely role in a feature film. But how long can her bittersweet freedom last when crisis strikes the zoo? Witness Maya, A Tiger's Tale on Al Jazeera.
Here are some of the media stories.
A critical look at the global news media
Spread of misinformation.
on Al Jazeera.
Government shut off access to social media.
This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Emily Angwin. This is the News Hour live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes. Supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr occupy Iraq's parliament for the second time in a week to protest the nomination of a rival prime minister. Spain reports a second death linked to monkeypox, while San Francisco and New York State declare public health emergencies. Ukraine waits to export grain while farmers come face to face with the growing problem of harvesting crops in a war zone. And Pope Francis says efforts by church-run schools in Canada to wipe out Indigenous culture amounted to genocide.
And I'm Peter Stemmert with your sport. George Russell claims his first Formula One pole position, and Liverpool claim early bragging rights over Manchester City, taking the Community Shield at Wembley Stadium.
And it's been wrapped up in...
We begin in Baghdad, where thousands of protesters have stormed the Iraqi parliament for a second time this week. Police fired tear gas at the crowds in the so-called Green Zone. More than 125 people have been injured. They're protesting against the nomination of Mohammed Shia al-Sudani as Prime Minister. Saturday's parliamentary session, at which Sudani's nomination was expected to be formally announced, was cancelled. The Speaker has now postponed all sessions until further notice.
We entered the parliament building for the third time to root out the corrupt political parties and militias. We are here to fix Iraq and get it back to its position by the word of the people and with God's blessing and our leader, Muqtada Sadr.
This is a message to the parliament members from the Iraqi people. It's over. The authority of this parliament is over and the power is for the people, and people will decide their destiny.
Baghdad's high-security green zone, where the protests are taking place, is the political heart of the city. The parliament is located inside that zone, along with other government offices. A short time ago, I spoke with Mahsen Al-Shamari, who's a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. She says there are growing concerns over the political instability in Baghdad.
The city is very much on high alert. Baghdad is no stranger to political upheaval, to protests. I mean, in 2019, we had protests that lasted months here, but it really does have an impact on everyday life, and it does create concerns on the population about the stability and the safety of the city going forward.
And speaking of that instability, al-Sadr made a big deal about exiting politics back in June. But looking at the events of this week, he's clearly still a player. So what does he want?
I mean, to clarify the language, he has only exited politics formally in terms of exiting parliament, but he has by no means exited politics. He's just moved the fight from parliament to the street. From what I hear, what he wants is he wants a revision of the political system, revolutionary aims of creating a new political system. There's, rumors of him wanting a new constitution. And that's really what is being said in Iraq. The things that are more clear about what he wants is he is adamant that his rivals, the coordination framework, and specifically former Prime Minister Nourain Maliki, do not get to designate a new Prime Minister.
Certainly a tall order there. Is there a solution that moves Iraq beyond not just this stalemate, but the current political divide? Does al-Sadr have the tools? Does he want that?
What's really worrisome in this situation is that what we just had in October, the election was supposed to be a solution to a political impasse. In 2019, up until February 2020, we had deeply destabilizing anti-government protests, but they were much more organic than the Sadr's protests that we see today. And as a consensus to the protesters and in mediation with the religious establishment, Iraq decided that we were going to have a new electoral law and early elections in October. And so this is where we are now. This is a product of early elections under a new electoral law with new political parties having won seats in parliament. And yet we find ourselves in the same position of limbo. And one of the deeply concerning things is some are saying that Sadr wants, other elections, other early elections, another interim government. And I'm just concerned that if anyone calls for any elections, the turnout is going to be very low because no one is interested in repeating this cycle of voting and then delegitimizing and voting again and really achieving no result.
Talk us through the makeup of these protesters. Hundreds, if not thousands, of what appears to be young men. Who are they and what do they want?
So the Sadr's demographic is young men from poorer, more populous areas in Iraq, particularly in the south and south center. Particular neighborhoods in Baghdad, like Sadr City, from the name clearly, are where a lot of them are from. And they tend to be younger, but there are older Sadrs who are the followers of Muqtada Sadr's father. A lot of them have typical grievances for Iraqi youth, unemployment, poverty, and they do tend to follow him in what has been described by many researchers and analysts as a cult-like figure. And the way that they will turn out and vote for him, they will pretty much do anything he asks them to do. But what I caution against thinking is that they are a majority of the Iraqi population, or that they're a majority of the youth population. These protesters and the Sadrists in general, if you look at the makeup of the votes in the recent election, really don't number much more than 1 million, if not less than 1 million, in a population of 40 million people. So what I say about them is that they're very loud, but they are a small group.
Okay, let's bring in Dorsa Jabari now, who's live for us in Baghdad. Hello there, Dorsa. You were among protesters in the Green Zone a little earlier today. Tell us what you saw and what more you know about these ongoing demonstrations.
Well, according to the demonstrators that we spoke to, they broke down the walls leading into the concrete walls that barricaded the green zone from the rest of Baghdad. They were really trying to get to the parliament building, which they managed to do in a very short amount of time. They were trying to make themselves seen and heard. They want to be as loud as possible, but what was clear was that the riot police nearby really were not given the authority, or they didn't have the interest to confront these demonstrators. They allowed them to enter and pour into the green zone, where they eventually managed to get into the parliament, and that's where they've been ever since this afternoon, and they are still there. They say that they are not going to go anywhere until their demands are met, and that they will follow Muqtada al-Sadr till the very end. One demonstrator I spoke to said that they were interested in a government free from corruption. Now, what that means is very much up to interpretation, because many analysts I've spoken to since say that the reason we're in this political crisis now is very much partly because Muqtada al-Sadr himself, who after the elections in October last year got the biggest number of seats in parliament, but short of a majority, his bloc refused to really come to any kind of an agreement to move forward into forming a new government and electing a new prime minister, which is where we are now. According to the Sadrists, they are not going to accept any nominees that are put forth by the other parties that are very much backed by Iran, that are in parliament here. So there is a stalemate, and some believe that that is because of the actions taken by Muqtada al-Sadr himself. Now, his supporters today have a very different opinion, of course. They say that they are following their leader, the politician and Shia cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, because they believe that he is right. He's left the political party a few weeks ago, saying that he will not take part in any kind of political process that is full of corruption, and he urged his 73 MPs from his bloc to do the same, and they left the Iraqi parliament, leaving it very much in limbo, as we're seeing now as a result of that political instability that is spilling out onto the streets. In terms of what is happening inside the parliament this evening, we understand these protesters are there to stay, which is a very different tone than we heard from them on Wednesday evening, where they stormed the parliament building as well. They said they are going to prevent any sessions from taking place where a nominee for the country's next president and prime minister could be put forth for the MPs to vote on.
And the Prime Minister addressed the public this afternoon. It seems his words have had no impact on the protesters inside the Parliament. What did he have to say?
Well, Mustafa Kadhimi is yet again finding himself in a very difficult and hostile situation between various political factions in this country, and the infighting that continues, even though he was brought in to try and alleviate some of those divisions. He was nominated and took the office of the Prime Minister in May of 2020. And tonight, he urged the demonstrators and the security forces to be calm and patient and rational, and not to be drawn into confrontation with each other, and that the situation is very difficult. Let's listen to some of what else he had to say.
I call on all to remain calm, patient and rational, and not to be dragged into confrontation. I call on citizens not to clash with security forces and to respect the state institutions. We should all work together to stop those who are accelerating the strike. Everybody knows the fire of sedition would burn us all.
One of the main concerns is that any kind of disagreement and confrontation between various factions in these parties could lead to violence. And of course, many of the different groups here are armed in Iraq, and there is a worry that any kind of escalation could lead to violence and possibly civil war, which is something everybody's trying to avoid at the moment. There is a sense that all parties are now hoping to at least trying to open up some kind of dialogue. And of course, the key player in all that being Muqtada al-Sadr himself, and whether or not his supporters will stay in parliament over the next few days will be an indication of whether or not any kind of dialogue is taking place between all sides to try and bring an end to what we are seeing unfold on the streets here.
Indeed, and no doubt you'll bring us up to speed when and if that happens. Thank you very much. Dorsa Jabari, live for us in Baghdad. Plenty more ahead on this news hour, including...
Everything's gone, like everything is gone. The whole life is gone.
Search and rescue efforts are underway in Kentucky, where torrential rains have swept away homes. A spike in migrant arrivals in Italy is changing the conversation ahead of September's elections. And a little later in sport with Peter, a great game with the glove and bat for this Major League Baseball player. In Iran, at least 80 people have been killed and 30 others are missing in floods that have devastated more than a dozen provinces over the past week. Several people were killed in a landslide in Tehran, where more than 30 died in 2 villages north of the capital. Search and rescue operations are continuing, with fears the death toll could rise. An emergency has been declared in the US state of Kentucky, where at least 25 people have died in severe floods there. Among the victims are 4 children from one family who were swept away. Gabriel Elizondo reports.
The Appalachian region of eastern Kentucky is underwater. Several days of rainfall have caused rivers to overflow their banks and entire towns to barely remain above water lines. The area got 2 months' worth of rainfall in the matter of just 2 days. With recovery and rescue efforts ongoing, in some areas, the floodwaters have not even crested yet. For those residents who did survive the storm, they told stories of horror.
Everything's gone, like everything is gone. The whole life is gone.
I was like, I don't want this apartment to buckle with me in it, so I just kind of was like, I'd rather be in the woods than be inside the apartment.
The flash flooding is so severe, even rescuers were shocked by what they were dealing with.
Probably 95% of the people in this area here has lost everything. Houses, cars, animals. It's heartbreaking, it really is.
These 4 siblings were all swept away in the floodwaters. They drowned, and their bodies have all been recovered. The governor, who declared a state of emergency, on Friday toured the hardest hit areas. Elsewhere in America, overnight monsoon rains in Las Vegas. Floodwaters seen coming through the roof of at least one of the city's famous casinos. There was also flooding in West Virginia, and hundreds were rescued from floodwaters in Missouri. While parts of America are soaking wet, other parts are melting. It all comes after the northeast of the U.S. saw unseasonably and dangerous record-high heat earlier this month, and meteorologists know what's causing it.
These type of events that have been occurring over the last couple of weeks across the country are directly attributable to climate change. These are big signals, extreme heat, heavy downpours that harken back to the changes in our atmosphere because of the additional carbon, because of the warming.
In Kentucky, cleanup will mostly have to wait because they're still in the search and rescue phase of this storm. Officials say the death toll is likely to climb. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera.
Spain has reported its second monkeypox-related death in the past 2 days. Spain's case numbers are Europe's highest at almost 4,300. Men are disproportionately affected. Only 64 of those infected in Spain are women. While New York State and the city of San Francisco have both declared a state of emergency due to rising infections there. New York's now home to 1 in 4 infections across the US, while 1,300 cases were reported there. 800 cases have been recorded in California. More than a quarter of those are in San Francisco. The global monkeypox outbreak has seen more than 21,000 cases in nearly 80 countries since May. For more on this story, let's bring in Mike Hanna, who joins us live from Washington, D.C. Hello there, Mike. What has been the federal response to the US emergency?
Well, the federal government says that it is continuing to ensure an ongoing supply of anti-monkeypox vaccine. It says it is getting in regular scheduled doses of the vaccine. At the same time, it insists that it's up to the states and to individual cities to take care of healthcare matters within their constituencies. So it is not embarking on a federal campaign in terms of dealing with this crisis, and crisis it is. The CDC's figures indicate that the rate of infection is increasing by some 10% every 2 days, but even these figures are regarded as being very low because they are based on recorded data, simply not enough information coming in. The other problem that we are seeing from the federal side is that some estimates now is that there's going to be a 3-month period where there is simply not enough vaccine to treat those who have been infected. Now, that is because there is a slowness, there's a laggard in terms of the vaccines coming into the country. The federal comments about getting the vaccine doesn't mention the fact that there is going to be a delay in the supply. Now, compounding this is that Jynneos, which is the most effective vaccine, is a 2-dose vaccination. There are simply not enough shots of the vaccine to be able to give 2 shots to every single person who wants it. Hence, this 3-month shortfall where there's going to be a shortage of vaccine while the infection rate is expected to increase. So very, very serious situation, and it's being left to the states and the city to deal with the matter themselves. The federal government says it will get vaccines as quickly as possible, but actually dealing with the crisis on the ground is a state and city matter, not a federal one.
And those states and cities have declared public emergencies. What does that mean in a practical sense?
Well, let's take a look at New York State, which is where the bulk of infections are happening. In that particular state, what the emergency declaration means is that paramedics, nurses are able to inject the vaccine. This means that a greater expanse of people are able to administer the vaccine. This is an important step, but at the same time, it doesn't ensure that there is enough vaccination there. But it also allows the state to look to federal government for greater assistance in terms of providing that vaccine, which has its problems, as I've mentioned. You also see San Francisco, for example, an individual city declaring a health emergency. In this particular case, what happens is that the city is opening itself up to resources from the state as well as from the federal government. So these are important steps, but it highlights the fact how this is being fought on a piecemeal basis. It's being left to states and individual cities to conduct some kind of plan to counteract what is happening here. I must just mention as well is that estimates are that some 1.6 million Americans who are most at risk will not be getting that double jab over the next few months. These are the 1.6 million are those estimated to be men who have either gay or bisexual relations, who are the exceedingly high-risk group. In New York State, for example, that's 99% of those who've been infected. So the situation here is while states and individual cities are trying to counter what is happening, there is still a delay in terms of the federal side of providing the most important tool to counteract, and that is the vaccination. Already, some states are using the smallpox vaccine, which is far less than ideal. So it is a critical situation, and it is one related not only to what is emerging on the ground, but also the supply chain issues in terms of obtaining the most efficacious vaccine.
All right, we really appreciate the update. Mike Hanna joining us live there from Washington, D.C. Thank you. To Ukraine now, where 17 ships loaded with grain are ready to depart from Odessa for the first time since Russia invaded back in February. More wheat and corn is being harvested while the war continues. But that doesn't come without problems. These pictures show fields burning in the Kharkiv region near the front lines. Farmers are accusing Russia of shelling the area. John Hendren filed this report from Odessa.
Ukraine and the world are waiting for 17 ships filled with grain to distribute food across the globe and help avert a global hunger crisis. President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday said those ships would leave soon, but they haven't left yet. There are a number of logistical problems involved with that. Some of those could be insurance, the fact that the waters are mined, and most importantly, security, because those ships will be traveling through an active war zone. We've also been told that the Secretary General, through a spokesman, and a Ukrainian strike that killed 50 people. Those people were prisoners who fought on behalf of Ukraine in Mariupol. One of the things they'll look at is whether that was an external strike, as the Russians claim. They say it was a Ukrainian missile, or whether it was an explosion from inside. That is what the Ukrainians claim. Volodymyr Zelensky says it was a war crime.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Western arms supplies to Ukraine are prolonging the war. That followed his call with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the first time the two have spoken since Russia invaded Ukraine. Former Special Assistant to President Bill Clinton, Toby Gatey, says Russia isn't interested in negotiating on many issues.
After 20 years of a more or less open Russia, we now have a Russia that's closing, that's becoming much more totalitarian in its treatment of its own people, and sees the West as an enemy, and in fact is preparing its population for a long war and for a reduced standard of living, all in the name of the glory of the Russian state. But Russia is expecting isolation and is preparing for it. And I think the war in Ukraine is a perfect example of that, where their view is they have certain goals and they would like to achieve those goals. And they're really not interested in whether we accept their definition of what Ukraine should look like or whether it should exist at all. So it's a really difficult situation because each side is suspicious of the other side, doesn't believe that there's any point in negotiating on some of these issues. I mean, this is amazing if you think about it. Our Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister have not spoken since the beginning of the Ukraine war because they don't think there's any point. And there probably isn't, because the fighting is going to go on. It'll go on all summer, all autumn. And in the winter, that's when probably negotiations will start.
Russian energy producer Gazprom says it has stopped supplying neighbouring Latvia with gas. The company accused Latvia of violating conditions for gas withdrawal, but didn't specify which conditions. A day earlier, a Latvian firm said it would pay Gazprom in euros rather than rubles. Russia also cut off supplies to Poland, Bulgaria, Finland, the Netherlands and Denmark when they refused to pay in rubles. More than 400 migrants and refugees have disembarked from a humanitarian ship in Taranto, Italy. The vessel, which is operated by the charity Sea-Watch, rescued the group from the Mediterranean Sea last week in 4 separate operations. Activists appealed for several days for permission to dock in Italy as passengers sweltered in temperatures of more than 40 degrees Celsius. The number of migrants and refugees heading to Europe is rising fast. There's been an 84% increase compared to last year, with nearly 115,000 irregular entries so far. The number of people crossing the eastern Mediterranean has more than doubled from a year ago. Most of the migrants on that route are Nigerian, Congolese or Syrian. Crossings along the central Mediterranean route are also up by 23%. It's most often used by people whose journeys began in Bangladesh, Egypt and Tunisia. The only route that's seen a drop in crossings is the western one from Morocco to Spain. 21% fewer migrants have used it compared to last year. Those crossings are usually made by Algerians, Syrians and Moroccans. And that increase in migrants to Italy is being politicised ahead of Italy's snap election in September. Natasha Ganaim reports on how the arrivals are influencing voters in Lampedusa.
The aquamarine waters of the Mediterranean, surrounded by craggy cliffs, keep luring tourists to these coves. However, vacationers aren't the reason this small Italian island has made headlines in recent years. In 2013, 368 migrants and refugees died when an overcrowded boat capsized near Lampedusa. It was one of the worst shipwrecks in modern European history. Francesco Baratta's father was fishing with a friend when he heard cries for help. He rescued a dozen people and became a national hero.
The people who think all migrants are criminals don't understand what it means to suffer for something and forget that the Westerners have exploited the same Africa they came from.
After people protested, the days when asylum seekers arrived and roamed the narrow streets are long gone. Now their presence is invisible to most, prompting one woman to accuse our crew of spreading misinformation.
There is a problem. When the sea is very calm like today, we see at least 1,500 people arriving each week. They are immediately transferred to Sicily or somewhere else. We don't see them on the island.
Yet the Migrant Welcome Center is overflowing. The uptick in arrivals coincides with the collapse of Prime Minister Mario Draghi's coalition government. This month, he announced his resignation twice. Far-right and populist parties torpedo Draghi's government and are expected to prevail in snap elections on September 25th. The Maggiore siblings come from one of the oldest families on Lampedusa. They make a living selling produce out of a truck in the city center.
We should vote for the far right and give them an opportunity to run the country before we say they are not good. Currently, migrants are coming here every day without any rules.
Barada hopes Italians won't allow far-right and populist candidates to scapegoat migrants. Almost a decade later, his father has remained in contact with some of the people he rescued, and he says the sadness in their eyes remains. Natasha Ghanem, Al Jazeera, Lampedusa, Italy.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, a rebellion by indigenous groups puts the leadership of Chile's young president to the test. Looking for alternatives, soaring gas prices have seen Kenyans switch to charcoal for cooking and heating their homes. And a little later in sport with Peter, George Russell finally claims a Formula One pole position.
Right, the weather's not quite as unusual as it was just a couple of days ago. There's still an awful lot of cloud around, considering it's middle summer, and it should be hot, dry and dusty, as you know. The showers are going to develop again on the Iranian side of the Gulf. This is taking you into Sunday. We still might get something in Kuwait, but it's less likely than it was, and it's a drier-looking picture. It's a bit more like it should be, with only Salalah catching the edge of monsoon rain in the form of drizzle and cloud around that city. By the time we get to Monday, the showers are going to completely disappear. Still, we get mountainous showers in Iran. There's been flooding here, as you probably know, and the same is possible from Riyadh down towards the mountains in the southwest of Saudi. Now, in contrast to that, Turkey's weather's been getting hotter and hotter and drier. Whilst a good part of Eastern Europe is seeing rain come in, it's pushed the heat down here. In fact, on the far eastern side, where the city of Cizre holds the record temperature for Turkey, it's getting up towards where it shouldn't be. 49 is the record. We've got a while to go, and I don't think we'll get there, but that part of Turkey is still hot. Now, just a quick reflection on the rains in Africa. There's been flooding again in Sudan and South Sudan. This year, the big showers in Ethiopia and Sudan and further west are still going.
State propaganda, media censorship, and the rise of authoritarian rule.
You wake up one day, the system has been turned from an electoral democracy into a competitive authoritarian regime.
A look at the lust for power in Hungary and Myanmar through the experiences of those who live it every day.
There is a pressure on us, but we have to be very careful, of course, and we have to be brave enough to support that pressure.
How democracy dies. Democracy Maybe on Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera's correspondents bring you the latest developments on the war in Ukraine.
We had to take cover. This is what's happening on a daily basis.
The medics here say he is incredibly lucky.
Those coming out have to cross the lines alone in this no man's land.
We're one of the few to gain access to this embattled town. They take us to their basement, where we find others sheltering from the shelling.
These evacuees now face a 3-day journey.
Devastated buildings are now a grim reminder that the Russians were here.
Hello, you're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Emily Angwin. Here's a reminder of your top stories this hour. Thousands of protesters have stormed the Iraqi parliament in Baghdad for a second time this week. Supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr are trying to block a political rival from being named Prime Minister. Parliamentary sessions have been postponed until further notice. Spain has reported its second monkeypox-related death in as many days. Infections are also rising in the United States. New York State and the city of San Francisco have declared public health emergencies. And 17 ships loaded with grain are waiting to leave Ukraine's Odessa port. Farmers are harvesting more in the middle of Russian shelling. Tens of millions of tons of grain are due to be exported under a deal struck last week. Pope Francis has called the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada's residential schools genocide. The head of the Roman Catholic Church spoke to reporters before the flight back to Italy. He delivered an official apology on Canadian soil to the Indigenous people who were abused at residential schools, most of which were run by the Catholic Church.